There was a time, not long ago, when Argentina was a name spoken with reverence. A land of promise, a continent's crown jewel. Ships once lined its ports, heavy with goods the world couldn't get enough of. Grain, beef, leather. Wealth poured in like wine into crystal, and the streets of Buenos Aires glittered under the weight of it all. Paris with palm trees, they called it. The future of the Western Hemisphere. Bankers in London studied its currency. Politicians in Washington envied its stability. Families from Italy, Spain, Germany uprooted their lives, risked everything, just to be part of its ascent. The Argentine dream was as real as any American one. But something went wrong. Slowly at first, quietly. No sirens, no explosions, just a shift, a decision here, an election there. Promises made, promises broken, and then, a crack in the foundation. Years passed, and the golden facades began to fade. Factories shuttered, stores emptied, then banks, then hope. The very people who once built cathedrals of commerce were now standing in food lines, screaming in the streets, fleeing the country their grandparents believed in. How does that happen? How does a country that had it all lose everything? This is not just a story about Argentina, it's about the fragile machinery that holds nations together. It's about trust, power, greed, and how quickly all of it can collapse. If you think it couldn't happen where you live, you haven't been paying attention. To understand how Argentina fell, you must first understand what it almost became. In the late 19th century, the world was watching a miracle unfold at the edge of the Southern Hemisphere. A country, young, vast, and raw, was reshaping itself with astonishing speed. Between 1880 and 1930, Argentina wasn't just rising, it was soaring. Fueled by rich natural resources and an insatiable global appetite for food, Argentina became an export machine. Its plains, La Pampa, were endless seas of grass, fattening cattle and growing wheat that would feed Europe. Its railways stretched like veins across the country, connecting inland ranches to ports humming with ships bound for London, Paris, and beyond. Beef, grain, leather. Argentina wasn't just selling food, it was feeding empires, and the money poured in. In the span of a single generation, Buenos Aires transformed from a colonial outpost into one of the most elegant cities on earth. Wide boulevards, marble palaces, opera houses, electric trams, designed with French ambition and built with British capital. If you had stood in the heart of the city in 1905, you might have mistaken it for Madrid, or even Paris itself. Political stability reinforced the dream. While much of Latin America struggled with coups and dictatorships, Argentina appeared to have found the secret formula: liberal economic policies, European immigration, infrastructure investment, and a vision of national progress. The upper class envisioned Argentina as an extension of Europe, just farther south and with more sunlight. And the world believed it. At the turn of the century, Argentina ranked among the 10 wealthiest countries on the planet. Its GDP per capita surpassed that of France, Italy, and even Germany. Immigrants flooded in: Italians, Spaniards, Germans, Jews from Eastern Europe. They brought their hands, their culture, and their dreams. A middle class emerged, education expanded, industry boomed, farmers became exporters, immigrants became business owners. For millions, Argentina wasn't just a new home, it was salvation, a fresh start in a country that seemed unstoppable. But behind the glamour, the cracks were already forming. Argentina's wealth was real but fragile. The economy was built on a narrow foundation: agriculture. Beef and grain made the nation rich, but made it vulnerable. A single drop in global demand could send shockwaves through the entire economy, and while the elite prospered, the vast rural population remained largely untouched by the riches of Buenos Aires. Still, the myth endured. Argentina, the land of cattle, tango, and wealth, was seen as the future of the New World. For a brief, shining moment, it truly was. But time has a way of revealing what glamour conceals, and as the 20th century moved forward, the dream began to shift, slowly, quietly, but decisively.
Perfect.
Every empire, no matter how gilded, eventually hears the knock at the door. By the late 1920s, Argentina still looked like a success story on paper. Its ports were bustling, its exports in demand, and its cities glowing with the confidence of a nation that had made it. But beneath the surface, something had changed. Argentina had grown rich, yes, but it had also grown dependent. Its prosperity hinged on one idea: that the world would always need what it had to sell. Beef, wheat, leather. Agriculture was its engine. and foreign capital kept the machine humming. There was no backup plan, no industrial base to weather storms, no domestic market strong enough to stand on its own, and no one at the top who seemed to care because the money was still flowing in. Until it stopped. In 1929, the world economy collapsed. The Great Depression swept across the globe like a plague, and Argentina, so heavily tied to Europe and the United States, was hit with devastating force. Exports plummeted, foreign investment vanished, banks failed. The elegant cafes of Buenos Aires emptied, and the working class, once promised a slice of the dream, found themselves jobless, hungry, and betrayed. Inequality, long ignored, exploded into view. While the wealthy shielded their fortunes, the poor were left with slogans. The middle class, once so proud, began to fracture under the weight of disillusionment. And into that void stepped a new force, one that had always lingered at the edge of Argentina's fragile democracy: the military. In 1930, for the first time in the nation's modern history, the army seized control of the government. Tanks in the streets, radios silenced, newspapers shuttered, the dream of liberal democracy shattered with a single order. It wasn't a chaotic rebellion, it was surgical, cold, controlled, and it had a purpose: to restore order in a time of crisis. But whose order, and at what cost? The coup was celebrated by elites who saw in it a return to discipline, a reassertion of control. But what it really marked was the end of Argentina's innocence. From this point forward, power would no longer live in institutions. It would live in uniforms, behind locked doors, whispered through phone lines, and once it moved into the shadows, it wouldn't come back out. The golden age had ended, and Argentina was now walking a tightrope between democracy and dictatorship, between promise and peril. By the mid-1940s, Argentina was exhausted. The old elite had lost its grip, the economy was volatile, and the people, especially the working class, were angry. They wanted answers. They wanted hope. And into that moment stepped a man who promised both. Juan Domingo Perón didn't come from wealth. He came from the military. But what he understood, perhaps better than anyone before him, was how to speak to the masses. He didn't talk about trickle-down economics. He talked about dignity, about jobs, about pride. In 1946, Perón rose to power on a wave of support from workers, labor unions, and the disillusioned poor. He wasn't just a politician, he was a symbol of something new: Argentine sovereignty, worker empowerment, and national rebirth. And by his side stood a woman who would become even more iconic. Eva Perón, Evita, electrified the country. She wasn't a queen, but she was treated like one by millions. She visited hospitals, kissed orphans, handed out shoes and food. She became a voice for the voiceless, a myth in real time. For the poor, she was salvation. For the rich, she was dangerous. Under Perón, Argentina changed rapidly. He nationalized railways, utilities, and key industries. He pushed out foreign companies, claiming the country had been sold off piece by piece to outsiders who only cared about profits. He raised wages, expanded unions, built schools, and poured money into public housing and welfare. For a while it worked. Factories roared back to life, workers earned more, streets filled with posters of Perón and Evita smiling down from balconies, promising a new Argentina, one that belonged to its people. But the prosperity came at a cost, and the bill would come due. To fund his ambitious social programs, Perón began printing money, lots of it. Inflation, once a whisper, became a roar. Investment dried up, foreign companies packed their bags. The nationalized industries that once made headlines as triumphs slowly decayed under inefficiency and political favoritism, and Perón himself, once the voice of the people, grew increasingly intolerant of opposition. Press freedoms eroded, dissenters were jailed. The same military he had once emerged from began watching him closely. Yet to many, especially the working class, none of that mattered. They remembered the hunger of the 1930s. And in Perón, they saw the only leader who had ever truly fought for them. By the early 1950s, Argentina was a paradox. It was more equal and less stable, more sovereign and more isolated. Perón had redefined the nation's identity, and in doing so had planted the seeds of both pride and dysfunction. And when Evita died in 1952, at just 33 years old, the country mourned like it had lost a saint. Her image would linger long after her death. So would Perón's shadow. He had given Argentina a new story to believe in, but it was one the country would struggle to sustain. In 1955, Juan Perón was overthrown in a military coup. Planes bombed the presidential palace. Tanks rolled through Buenos Aires. His portrait was torn down, his name erased from public buildings. And once again, Argentina stood at a crossroads. Its democracy dismantled, its identity fractured. But what followed was not stability, it was chaos. For the next 3 decades, Argentina would lurch between civilian governments and military dictatorships, like a pendulum without rhythm. Each new leader promised order. Each new regime left deeper scars. In the 1960s, brief democratic experiments flickered to life, but were swiftly extinguished. In their place came generals in uniform, ruling not by consensus but by command. The economy staggered under the weight of mismanagement. Currency collapses, IMF bailouts, corruption, price freezes, inflation so brutal it could devour a lifetime of savings in a matter of weeks. And in the shadows, something darker. During the 1970s, the military regime launched what it called a national reorganization process. It promised security. What it delivered was terror. The dirty war had begun. Anyone suspected of dissent, journalists, students, activists, teachers, could be taken. No charges, no trials, just gone. Over 30,000 people disappeared. Mothers and fathers left waiting in silence. Empty chairs at dinner tables, unanswered doors, only whispers and rumors remained, and a deep national silence that still hasn't fully lifted. But resistance endured. In 1977, a small group of mothers began walking quietly in a circle in front of the presidential palace. They wore white headscarves, each embroidered with the name of a missing child. The mothers of the Plaza de Mayo became a moral force the regime could not silence. Still, the junta held power, until 1982. That year, in a desperate bid to revive public support, the military launched an invasion of the Falkland Islands, or, as Argentines call them, the Malvinas. A remote cluster of islands held by Britain, the move was sold to the people as an act of patriotic redemption. But it was a gamble, and a devastating miscalculation. The war lasted just 10 weeks. British forces, better equipped and better trained, crushed the Argentine military. Ships sank, soldiers froze. Young conscripts, many barely out of school, died for an illusion. When the war ended in defeat, the spell was broken. The generals had promised glory, they delivered shame, the people had had enough. The junta collapsed under the weight of failure, and in 1983, democracy returned. But what kind of country had democracy inherited? The world once called Argentina a paradise. Now it was a nation haunted by ghosts. Some buried beneath unmarked graves, others still walking the streets carrying wounds no election could heal. When democracy returned in the 1980s, many believed Argentina could finally turn the page. But rebuilding a broken country is not just about casting votes, it's about healing wounds that go deeper than politics, and deeper still than economics. By the 1990s, a new generation of leaders promised to modernize Argentina. Globalization was in full swing. Neoliberal reforms swept the developing world. Argentina joined the wave with both feet. Privatization was the new gospel. Railroads, water, electricity, even the national oil company, sold to foreign investors. The peso was pegged 1-to-1 with the US dollar to stop inflation. For a moment it worked. Inflation fell. Consumer goods flooded in. Foreign credit was cheap and plentiful. Argentines traveled, spent, and believed again. Buenos Aires glimmered, malls opened, imports soared. But underneath this new facade, the rot had not disappeared. It had only been dressed up in Armani suits and imported champagne. The currency peg made exports expensive. Local industries collapsed. Jobs vanished. Government debt ballooned. Every dollar borrowed had to be paid back in actual dollars. The illusion of prosperity came at a staggering cost. By the late 1990s, cracks turned to fissures. The economy stalled, debt exploded, and then the world changed. In December 2001, Argentina defaulted on $93 billion of debt, the largest sovereign default in history. The banks froze all accounts, ATMs stopped dispensing cash. Overnight, people were locked out of their own savings. The middle class, once the pride of Argentina, was decimated. Families that once owned homes were suddenly begging for bread. Parents sold wedding rings for rice. Children dug through garbage for scraps. Outside the banks, lines turned into riots. Protesters bashed pots and pans in what became known as the cacerolazo, the sound of collective despair. Within 2 weeks, 5 presidents came and went. The government was in freefall. The peso collapsed. Unemployment soared above 20%. Schools closed, supermarkets were looted, superpowers watched from afar. This wasn't just a recession, this wasn't a correction, this was a national nervous breakdown. People began bartering silverware for bread, entire neighborhoods formed trading clubs, exchanging eggs for flour, shoes for soap. The formal economy had died, what remained was survival. And for a country once ranked among the wealthiest on earth, that collapse wasn't just financial, it was existential. By 2003, Argentina was on its knees, but the fall had stopped, and a new era was about to begin. Nestor Kirchner, a little-known governor from Patagonia, took office amid the ashes of crisis. He spoke of sovereignty, of rebuilding from within. And with global commodity prices booming, Argentina finally had a lifeline. Soybeans, beef, oil. The world was hungry, and Argentina could feed it. Growth returned, poverty declined, the streets quieted. For the first time in years, the country exhaled. Nestor stepped down in 2007, handing power to his wife, Cristina Fernández de Kirchner. Together, they shaped a political dynasty built on nationalism, social programs, and an unrelenting narrative. Argentina would never bow again. But beneath the recovery, the old ghosts stirred. Inflation returned, government spending ballooned, subsidies became unsustainable. Currency controls were imposed, foreign investment fled, critics were silenced, institutions hollowed out, and quietly, a new exodus began. Young Argentines, engineers, doctors, scientists, left in waves, a brain drain that carried not just talent, but hope. By 2018, the cycle had turned again. The peso plummeted. Investors panicked. And once more, Argentina knocked on the door of the International Monetary Fund, this time for $57 billion, the largest bailout in IMF history. The deal came with strings, austerity, reforms, cuts, and for many, it felt like betrayal, a painful echo of crises past. Then came COVID-19, a pandemic that paralyzed the world and shattered Argentina's fragile recovery. Lockdowns, supply shocks, spiraling costs. Inflation roared past 100%, prices changed weekly, supermarkets became battlefields of survival. Even middle-class families watched their salaries evaporate by the month. And in politics, the old fault lines widened. Populists versus reformers, left versus right, nationalists versus globalists. The arguments were the same, only the faces had changed. Argentines have lived through more economic experiments than most nations could imagine. They've seen radical privatization and radical nationalism, austerity and stimulus, dollarization and devaluation, democracy and dictatorship, boom and collapse, again and again and again. Today, Argentina stands not at a crossroad, but on a carousel that never seems to stop spinning. For many, survival has become a quiet, grinding act of rebellion. Parents stay not because they believe in the system, but because they refuse to abandon their roots, because they remember what their grandparents built, and hope, desperately, that one day their children might see it reborn. Argentina didn't lose everything, it lost its way, again and again. But its people, they never disappeared. They endured military dictatorships, crushing inflation, global isolation. They watched fortunes made and erased in a single generation. They lived through broken promises, vanished leaders, and the sound of pots and pans echoing through silent nights. But somehow, they remain, fiercely proud, endlessly resilient, and in ways that numbers can't measure, undefeated. Look closer and you'll see the pulse of a country still alive. You'll see tango dancers spinning through plazas. You'll hear the clatter of keyboards in new tech hubs, where young coders dream in JavaScript instead of pesos. You'll find digital nomads building startups to escape inflation, and inventing futures when their government no longer can. You'll see artists, filmmakers, scientists, chefs, all refusing to surrender their culture to chaos. You'll see a generation trying to rewrite the story, not by erasing the past, but by confronting it. Argentina is not a tragedy, it's a question, one that still has no answer. Can a country rewrite its story when its past always haunts its future? Because this story, it's not just Argentina's, it's a mirror, a warning, a whisper to every nation that thinks itself immune to collapse, that believes wealth is permanent, that institutions can't rot, that democracy is guaranteed. What happened to Argentina could happen anywhere. And if you're still watching, that means you care. About history, about patterns, about people. So if this moved you, if this made you think, help share this story. Like this video, share it with someone who still believes nations can't fall, and subscribe to this channel if you want more stories that dig deeper than headlines. Stories that show how the past never really goes away because history doesn't just repeat, it warns.